Under the blistering sun of Arizona Territory, dust devils danced across the barren landscape like ghosts remembering their names. Samuel Cross rode his weathered stallion through the heat shimmer, his shadow cutting sharp against the cracked earth. The year was 1887, and the world had grown smaller, meaner, more divided. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following a lead that might finally answer the prayers he had whispered into countless starless nights. The town of Bitter Creek sat like a scar on the desert floor, its wooden buildings bleached white by decades of unforgiving sun. Samuel reined in his horse at the edge of town, studying the scene before him. Dust-covered men moved with the slow gait of those who had given up on hope long ago. Women in faded dresses hurried past with downcast eyes, and somewhere in this forsaken place, if the letter in his saddlebag spoke truth, was the daughter he had been searching for these past 8 years. Samuel dismounted and tied his horse to a weathered hitching post outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. His boots struck the wooden boardwalk with hollow thuds as he approached the largest house on the street, a 2-story structure that stood like a monument to wealth built on the backs of the desperate. The brass nameplate beside the ornate door read, "Judge Harrison Blackwood." Samuel straightened his shoulders, removed his hat, and knocked. The door opened to reveal a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, with skin the color of desert sand and eyes that held depths Samuel recognized but dared not name aloud. She wore the simple grey dress of a servant, her long black hair braided severely back, but there was something in her posture, in the way she held her chin, that spoke of nobility buried beneath circumstances. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice soft but clear, tinged with an accent that made Samuel's heart skip like a stone across still water. "I'm here to see Judge Blackwood," Samuel said, his throat suddenly dry as alkali dust. "Name's Samuel Cross. I have business regarding a missing person." The young woman's eyes flickered with something unnamed: fear, hope, recognition, but she merely nodded and stepped aside. "Please wait in the parlor, Mr. Cross. I'll fetch the judge." As she turned to go, Samuel caught sight of something that made his breath catch in his chest. There, on the inside of her left wrist, as she gestured toward the parlor, was a small crescent-shaped scar. A scar he had kissed 1,000 times when it was fresh, when it belonged to a 7-year-old girl who had fallen from an apple tree while trying to reach the highest branch. A scar that belonged to his daughter. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She paused, not turning back. "Maria, sir. They call me Maria." But Samuel knew better. He had named her something else entirely, in another life, in another world, where a half-Apache child could be claimed by her white father without shame or consequence. Judge Blackwood entered the parlor like a storm cloud gathering strength. He was a large man, well-fed and well-dressed, with the kind of authority that came from years of deciding other people's fates. His eyes were cold grey, calculating, and they fixed on Samuel with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Mr. Cross," Blackwood said, settling his considerable bulk into a leather chair, "I understand you're inquiring about a missing person. Might I ask what brings you to my home specifically?" Samuel remained standing, hat clutched in weathered hands that had held rifles and reins and the lifeless body of his wife. 8 years ago, my daughter was taken during a raid on our homestead outside of Tucson. I've been searching for her ever since. Recently, I received word that a young woman matching her description was living here, in your employ." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Samuel caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Mr. Cross, I employ several young women in my household, servants, kitchen help, cleaning girls. Most of them are, well, let's say they're grateful for honest work, rather than the alternatives this territory offers to women of their particular heritage." But the way he said particular heritage made Samuel's jaw clench. "My daughter's name is Aiyana. She would be 20 now. She has a scar on her left wrist, crescent-shaped, and her mother's eyes." "Mr. Cross," Blackwood said, leaning forward with the practiced sympathy of a politician. "I understand your pain. Truly I do. But the girl you're describing, Maria, has been with my household for 5 years. She came to us as an orphan, no family, no past to speak of. She's been nothing but grateful for the roof over her head and the honest work we provide. I'd like to speak with her. I'm afraid that's not possible. She's quite busy with her duties, and frankly, Mr. Cross, disturbing my household staff with wild claims about their identities seems rather inappropriate." Samuel set his hat on the small table beside his chair and met Blackwood's gaze directly. "Judge, I'm not a man given to wild claims. I've spent 8 years following false leads and broken hearts. But I know my daughter when I see her, and that young woman who answered your door has her mother's eyes and the scar I watched heal when she was 7 years old." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the parlor, the air thick with unspoken threats and barely contained truths. Finally, Blackwood rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to having his word be final. "Mr. Cross, I think it's time you left my home. If you continue to harass my household with these delusions, I'll be forced to involve the sheriff." Samuel stood as well, but he made no move toward the door. "Funny thing about sheriffs, Judge. They tend to ask uncomfortable questions when a man reports finding his long-lost daughter living as a servant in another man's house. Questions about how she got there, why she has no memory of her past, why her legal guardian never reported finding her." The color drained from Blackwood's face, but his voice remained steady. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Cross?" "Just stating facts, Judge. Facts have a way of coming to light, especially when there's a determined father involved." That evening, Samuel took a room at the boarding house across from Blackwood's mansion. From his window, he could see the yellow glow of lamplight in the kitchen, where shadows moved behind thin curtains. He watched for hours, studying the rhythm of the household, the comings and goings of servants, the patterns of daily life that might give him an opportunity to speak with the young woman called Maria. It was near midnight when he saw her slip out the back door, a water bucket in each hand, heading toward the well behind the house. Samuel pulled on his boots and crept down the boarding house stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The desert night was cool and crystal clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds. Samuel approached the well carefully, staying in the shadows until the young woman had filled both buckets and was preparing to return to the house. "Aiyana," he whispered. She froze, the buckets trembling in her hands. Slowly, she turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with something that might have been recognition or might have been terror. "My name is Maria," she said, but her voice shook as she spoke. Samuel stepped into the moonlight, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Your name is Aiyana Crossfeather. Your mother was running deer of the Chiricahua Apache. You were born on a Tuesday morning in October, and the first thing you ever reached for was a sunbeam coming through the cabin window." Tears began to spill down her cheeks, silver tracks in the moonlight. I don't remember." "You fell from an apple tree when you were 7, Samuel continued, his own voice breaking. "Cut your wrist on a broken branch. I carried you 2 miles to the nearest doctor, and you never cried once, not even when he stitched it up. You said brave girls don't cry over little cuts." She dropped the buckets, water splashing across the dusty ground, and pressed her hands to her temples as if trying to force memories through a barrier of pain and time. "There are dreams sometimes. A man with kind eyes who sang to me in 2 languages. A woman who smelled like sage and told stories about birds that carried prayers to the sky. Your mother," Samuel breathed. "She used to say that prayers were just love with wings." Aiyana looked up at him then, really looked, and in her eyes Samuel saw the recognition dawn like sunrise over the desert. "Papa?" The word hit him like a physical blow, 8 years of grief and searching and desperate hope all colliding in that single syllable. He opened his arms, and she flew into them, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than bone, deeper than blood. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his chest. "When the soldiers came, when they took me away, they said everyone was dead. They said I was an orphan, that no one would ever come for me." Samuel held her tight, his own tears falling into her hair. "I've been looking for you every day since. Every single day." They held each other in the moonlight beside the well, two souls reunited across an ocean of loss and time. But their reunion was short-lived. The sound of boots on wooden planks made them spring apart, and Judge Blackwood appeared in the doorway of his house, a rifle in his hands and cold fury in his eyes. "Maria," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Come inside. Now." Aiyana looked between her father and the man who had controlled her life for 5 years, her body trembling with indecision and fear. "I have to go," she whispered. "If I don't, he'll hurt the other girls." "What other girls?" "There are 6 of us, all Apache, all taken as children. If any of us cause trouble." She touched her cheek, and Samuel saw the faint outline of an old bruise. "He says we're his property now, that we owe him everything for keeping us fed and clothed." Samuel's vision went red around the edges, a familiar rage rising in his chest like a tide of fire. "That bastard has been keeping you as slaves." "Don't," Aiyana said, gripping his arm. "Please, if you do something now, tonight, the others will pay for it. Promise me you'll be smart about this." Samuel forced himself to breathe, to think beyond the immediate urge to put a bullet between Blackwood's eyes. "Tomorrow," he said. "We end this tomorrow." Aiyana nodded and bent to retrieve the fallen buckets. As she walked back toward the house, Samuel called softly after her. "Aiyana!" She turned. "I never stopped praying for you." "I know," she whispered. "I could feel them sometimes in the darkness, like gentle hands." The next morning, Samuel was waiting in the sheriff's office when Deputy Collins arrived to start his day. Collins was a young man, maybe 25, with honest eyes and the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he had actually gone into law enforcement to help people rather than to wield power over them. "Deputy," Samuel said, rising from the wooden chair where he had been waiting since dawn, "I need to report a crime." Collins poured himself coffee from the pot on the wood stove and settled behind his desk. "What kind of crime, Mr. Cross?" "Samuel Cross. And the crime is slavery, Deputy. Judge Blackwood has been keeping Apache girls as unpaid servants, telling them they're orphans with no family, no rights, no hope of freedom." Collins nearly choked on his coffee. "Mr. Cross, those are serious accusations. Judge Blackwood is a respected member of this community." "Respected men have committed terrible crimes before," Samuel said. "One of those girls is my daughter, taken during a raid 8 years ago. I can prove it." For the next hour, Samuel laid out everything he knew, everything he had discovered, and everything he suspected about Blackwood's household. Collins listened with growing alarm, taking notes and asking careful questions. When Samuel finished, the deputy sat back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. "Mr. Cross, if what you're saying is true, but investigating a territorial judge, that's not something I can do lightly. I'd need evidence, witnesses, something more than accusations." "Then let's get it." That afternoon, while Judge Blackwood was holding court in the courthouse across town, Samuel and Deputy Collins approached the mansion with a search warrant Collins had somehow managed to secure from the territorial marshal. The house seemed strangely quiet as they knocked on the front door. It was Aiyana who answered, but she was not alone. Behind her stood 5 other young women, all Apache, all wearing the same grey servants' dresses, all with the same haunted look in their eyes. The oldest couldn't have been more than 22. The youngest looked barely 16. "Ladies," Deputy Collins said, removing his hat, "I'm Deputy Collins, and this is Mr. Cross. We're here to ask you some questions about your living situation." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Aiyana stepped forward, her chin raised with the same defiance Samuel remembered from her childhood. "We're here against our will," she said simply. "All of us. We were taken as children, told our families were dead, and forced to work without pay. If we complained or tried to leave, we were beaten. If we spoke our native language, we went without food. One by one, the other girls stepped forward with their own stories. Children stolen from their families, told they were orphans, forced into servitude under the guise of charity. Some had been with Blackwood for years, others had arrived more recently, but all shared the same story of captivity disguised as kindness. Deputy Collins documented every word, his face growing grimmer with each testimony. When they finished, he looked at Samuel with something like awe. "Mr. Cross, this is the biggest case this territory has seen in years. You've just uncovered a slavery ring operating under the cover of Christian charity." Samuel wasn't listening. He was looking at his daughter, seeing not just the young woman she had become, but the child she had been, the years they had lost, the life they might have had together if hatred and prejudice hadn't torn them apart. "Papa," Aiyana said softly, and in that word was forgiveness for all the years he hadn't been there to protect her, understanding for all the pain they had both endured, and hope for whatever came next. The trial of Judge Harrison Blackwood became the scandal of the territory. Newspapers from as far away as San Francisco sent reporters to cover the story of the respected jurist who had built his wealth on the backs of stolen children. The courtroom was packed every day with settlers, soldiers, Apache representatives, and curiosity seekers, drawn by the drama of it all. Samuel testified on the third day, describing the raid that had taken his daughter, the years of searching, the moment of recognition beside the well. His voice never wavered as he spoke of finding Aiyana alive but broken, of discovering the systematic abuse that had been hidden behind a facade of respectability. Aiyana testified on the fourth day. She spoke in clear, measured tones about her captivity, about the other girls who had shared her fate, about the daily humiliations and casual cruelties that had been their lives. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that she had been treated well, fed and clothed and sheltered, she looked him directly in the eye. "Sir," she said, "a bird in a cage may be fed and sheltered, but it is still a prisoner. The fact that Judge Blackwood provided food and a roof does not change the fact that we were slaves." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Guilty on all counts." And Judge Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. His assets were seized and distributed among his victims as restitution. The mansion where Aiyana and the other girls had been held was sold, and the proceeds used to establish a fund for displaced Apache children. But for Samuel and Aiyana, the real healing began after the trial ended, in the quiet moments when they could finally learn to be father and daughter again. They left Bitter Creek on a Tuesday morning in early spring, riding side by side toward the mountains where the desert gave way to pine forests and clear streams. Samuel had bought a small ranch in Colorado Territory, far from the memories and prejudices of Arizona, where they could start over without the weight of their past hanging over them like storm clouds. For the first few days, they rode in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Aiyana was learning to remember who she had been before captivity, while Samuel was learning to see who she had become despite it. She was no longer the 7-year-old who had fallen from apple trees and reached for sunbeams. She was a woman who had survived 8 years of captivity with her spirit intact, who had found the courage to speak truth to power, who carried within her the strength of 2 peoples and the wisdom of profound loss. On their 4th night out from Bitter Creek, they made camp beside a stream that sang softly over smooth stones. Samuel built a fire, while Aiyana tended to the horses, both of them moving with the easy efficiency of people accustomed to taking care of themselves. When the chores were done, they sat beside the fire and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Papa," Aiyana said finally, "tell me about Mama." Samuel smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She could track a deer for miles without making a sound, speak 4 languages fluently, and make the best fry bread this side of creation. But more than that, she was kind. Even when the world was cruel to her, even when people looked at her with suspicion because she had married a white man, she never lost her capacity for kindness. How did you meet her? I was 22, cocky as hell, and convinced I knew everything about everything. I was working as a scout for the army, and my job was to help negotiate a peace treaty with her band. The first time I saw her, she was teaching children to weave baskets by the river. She looked up at me and said, "You walk too loud for a scout," and I fell in love with her voice before I even saw her face. Aiyana laughed, a sound like water over stones. She said that? First words she ever spoke to me. I spent the next 3 months learning to walk quietly just to impress her. They talked until the fire burned low, sharing memories and filling in the gaps that 8 years of separation had left in their understanding of each other. Samuel told her about the first years after she was taken, when he had drunk too much and cared too little about his own survival. He told her about the moment he had decided to stop drowning in grief and start swimming toward hope. Aiyana told him about the other girls, about how they had taken care of each other in small ways that their captors never noticed. She told him about the nights when she had whispered Apache prayers under her breath, keeping alive the language and stories her mother had taught her. She told him about the dreams where she could still hear his voice singing lullabies in 2 languages. As the fire died to embers, Aiyana reached into the small bundle of possessions she had been allowed to take from Blackwood's house. She pulled out a small piece of turquoise, worn smooth by countless touches. "I've carried this since the night they took me," she said, holding it out to Samuel. "It was in my pocket when the soldiers came. I never let them find it." Samuel recognized it immediately. It was from a necklace Running Deer had worn, a piece of sky-blue stone that had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother. He had given it to Aiyana on her 6th birthday, telling her it would always connect her to her mother's people and her mother's strength. "You kept it all these years." "It kept me," she said simply. "When I forgot what I looked like before the grey dresses and braided hair, when I started to believe I really was just Maria the servant girl, I would hold this and remember that I was Aiyana Crossfeather, daughter of Running Deer and Samuel Cross, child of 2 worlds and beloved by both." Samuel felt tears sting his eyes as he closed his fingers around the small stone. It was warm from her touch, smooth from years of secret caresses, and precious beyond measure, not for its material value, but for what it represented. The unbreakable connection between parent and child, the power of love to survive even the darkest circumstances. The ranch in Colorado was everything Samuel had hoped it would be. Remote enough for privacy, beautiful enough for healing, and fertile enough to support the quiet life he and Aiyana were building together. The house was small but solid, with a wide porch that faced east toward the mountains and south toward the desert they had left behind. Aiyana threw herself into the work of making it home with the same determination she had shown in surviving her captivity. She planted a garden with vegetables and herbs, learned to cook the foods Samuel remembered from his childhood, and slowly began to integrate the Apache traditions her mother had taught her with the daily rhythms of ranch life. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked, sharing more memories and making plans for the future. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply grateful to be together and free. It was during one of these quiet evenings, about 6 months after they had arrived at the ranch, that Aiyana made an announcement that changed everything. "Papa," she said, her voice soft but determined, "I want to go back." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. "Back? To Arizona?" "Not to stay," she said quickly, "but there are other girls, other children who are still missing. What happened to me, to the others in Blackwood's house, that wasn't an isolated case. There are more Aiyanas out there, more families torn apart, more children who think they're orphans when they're really just stolen. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was saying. You want to help find them. I want to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else. Samuel looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who had survived captivity and found the strength not just to heal, but to help others heal as well. He thought about the years he had spent searching for her, the letters he had written to officials who didn't care, the leads he had followed to nowhere. He thought about all the other parents out there who were still searching, still hoping, still praying for their children to come home. "All right," he said finally, "how do we start?" They started by writing letters. Letters to territorial governors, to army commanders, to newspaper editors, to anyone who might listen to their story and understand the scope of the problem they were trying to address. They told the story of Blackwood's house, of the 6 girls who had been kept as servants, of the systematic way children were being stolen from their families and sold into various forms of bondage. The response was slow at first, but gradually they began to hear from other families, other survivors, other people who had pieces of the puzzle they were trying to solve. A network began to form, connected by shared tragedy, but united by hope and determination. Samuel and Aiyana made their first trip back to Arizona Territory in the spring of 1889, 2 years after they had left Bitter Creek behind. They went not as father and daughter seeking refuge, but as investigators seeking justice. Their reputation had preceded them, and they found doors opening that had been previously closed, officials who had ignored their letters now eager to meet with them in person. They found 3 more children that trip. A boy of 12 who had been working on a ranch outside Tucson told he was an orphan when his parents were actually alive and searching for him in Mexico. Twin girls, 10 years old, who had been placed with a family in Phoenix and were being treated more like unpaid laborers than adopted daughters. Each reunion was a small miracle, each family made whole again, a victory against the forces that sought to divide and destroy. But perhaps the most important thing they found on that trip was each other, again and differently. Working together toward a common goal, Samuel and Aiyana discovered that they were not just father and daughter, but partners in a mission larger than themselves. They were good at this work, good at listening to stories of loss and following threads of evidence, and, most importantly, good at helping people believe that their missing children could still be found. Over the next 5 years, they helped reunite more than 30 families. They worked with territorial authorities to establish new laws protecting Native children from exploitation. They testified before Congress about the need for federal oversight of adoption and guardianship practices. They became, in their quiet way, a force for justice in a system that had too often turned a blind eye to injustice. But the work took its toll. Samuel aged rapidly, the constant travel and emotional weight of the cases they handled etching lines around his eyes and silver into his hair. Aiyana never complained, but he could see the cost of constantly reliving her own trauma by helping others heal from theirs. It was on a warm evening in June 1894, 7 years after their reunion at the well in Bitter Creek, that Samuel brought up the subject of Aiyana's future. "You know," he said as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, "you don't have to spend your whole life fixing what other people broke." Aiyana looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're 27 years old, and you've spent the last 7 years helping other people find their families. Maybe it's time you thought about building your own family." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with the turquoise stone she still wore on a chain around her neck. "I've thought about it," she said finally, "but I can't imagine loving someone who didn't understand this work, who didn't understand why it matters so much. Then find someone who does understand." 3 months later, at a conference of territorial social workers in Denver, Aiyana met Dr. James Whitehorse, a Cherokee physician who had dedicated his practice to treating Native children in government schools and orphanages. He was 32, gentle-eyed, and had his own stories of loss and recovery that resonated with Aiyana's experiences. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters, as his work kept him traveling throughout the Colorado and Utah territories, while she and Samuel continued their reunification efforts. But the letters revealed a meeting of minds and hearts that transcended the physical distance between them. James understood without explanation why Aiyana sometimes woke in the middle of the night, speaking Apache words in her sleep. Aiyana understood without judgment why James sometimes spent entire evenings in silence, processing the trauma he encountered in his work with institutionalized children. They were married in the spring of 1895, in a ceremony that blended Cherokee, Apache, and Christian traditions. Samuel walked his daughter down an aisle scattered with wildflowers and gave her away to a man who promised to honor not just Aiyana, but the work that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The newlyweds settled on a ranch adjacent to Samuel's, close enough for daily contact but far enough for privacy. James established a practice treating the physical and emotional wounds of children who had been separated from their families, while Aiyana continued her reunification work with Samuel's help and support. It was a good life, full of purpose and love and the kind of quiet joy that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And when Aiyana gave birth to her first child in the winter of 1896, a daughter with Samuel's grey eyes and running deer's strong spirit, the circle that had been broken so many years ago was finally, truly complete. They named her Hope because that was what she represented. The promise that love could survive anything, that families could be rebuilt even after they had been destroyed, and that children born into a world of division and hatred could still grow up surrounded by the radical belief that every life has value and every person deserves to come home. Samuel held his granddaughter for the first time on a snowy Tuesday morning in December, and as he looked into her eyes, he whispered the same prayer he had whispered for 8 years when he thought his daughter was lost forever. "May you always know who you are," he said. "May you always know you are loved. And may you always have the strength to find your way home, no matter how far you travel or how lost you become." Outside, snow fell softly on the Colorado mountains, covering the world in pristine white. Inside, 3 generations of a family sat together in the warmth of a wood stove's glow, proof that some prayers are answered not with lightning, but with patience, not with miracles, but with the steady accumulation of small acts of faith and love and stubborn refusal to give up hope. The story of Samuel and Aiyana Cross became legend in the territories, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables as an example of what could happen when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. But for Samuel, the story was simpler than legend. It was about a father who never stopped looking for his daughter, and a daughter who never stopped believing she would be found. And in the end, that was prayer enough.